In May 2009, Forbes listed Peebles as one of the top 10 wealthiest Black Americans in the country. Without further ado, I welcome Mr. R. Donahue Peebles.
Don, thank you very much. And Tiffany, thank you very much for having me. It's very good to be here. Very good to be speaking to the next generation of leaders for our country, and being able to be back at Morehouse virtually, unfortunately not there in person. I remember the last visit I had there, I was inducted into the Martin Luther King Jr. Hall of Fame at Morehouse, and Blair Underwood, the actor, and I were brought in together, and I was, just reminded of the impact that Morehouse has had in our country for Black Americans for so long. I think what would be helpful maybe is for me to give you all a little bit of history about who I am, where I came from, and what I do today. So I was born in 1960, so that makes me 60 years old. So I was born in 1960 in Washington, D.C., and the 1960s was the epicenter of the civil rights movement. Washington, D.C. was the epicenter of most of the major protests, March on Washington, Poor People's March, and so many things. And so, and my parents, my mother had me at 19 years old, and my mother was a secretary for the government. My father was a clerical worker for the federal government and a part-time auto mechanic. My maternal grandfather was a hotel doorman at the Wardman Park Hotel in Washington, D.C., and my paternal grandfather was a janitor in a public school, actually a public school in the community where my father and his siblings grew up in, but he couldn't go to school there because of segregation. So I was shaped as a person because of the 1960s. I can remember when Dr. King was assassinated. I can remember the protest and riots that took place following his death. I remember the death of Robert Kennedy as well, and I remember it vividly because my teacher cried. And then I remember how our country began to move forward for African Americans. And so, and I became much more conscious about our country in the 1970s. And that was in the transition from finishing up in the civil rights movement, which unfortunately was pretty much brought to a halt in some regards after significant progress because of the assassination of Dr. King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and others. But they had knocked down some tremendous barriers. And so my last 2 years of high school, my mother, who had worked as a secretary on Capitol Hill, thought it would be a good place for me to go finish up high school. So my parents got divorced when I was 5. My mother got remarried, and she bought a house in a community called Prince George's County, a suburb of Washington, D.C. And there, she and her new husband bought a house in a new subdivision that was an integrated subdivision. And so many Black families moved there. And my mother at the closing table saw this line item on the closing statement for commission. And she inquired as to what that was for. And it was for the sales agent who showed her the model house. And she said, wait a minute, he makes that kind of money and for that little bit of time. And she thought she could do that. And so she went to night school and she got her real estate license. She got divorced from her second husband and she moved to Detroit with me in 1968. Where her sister and her husband, who was a physician doing his residency and internship in Detroit. So we moved there, and she worked there as a real estate agent. And within 2 years, she started her own brokerage business, and my uncle was an investor in her business. So she started her brokerage business, and I was about 9 or 10 years old. And so I was pretty aware of real estate. So we lived in Detroit, which was a empowering experience because it was still Motown Records was in Detroit. Detroit's automobile industry was reaching out to and providing opportunities to Black suppliers and contractors. So there was a significant amount of Black wealth in Detroit. My best friend growing up was Kerry Gordy, and his father was Barry Gordy, who founded Motown Records. So I was exposed to Black entrepreneurs very early. And then my uncle was a doctor, and my mother was one of 5 girls, and her other sisters, husbands were a lawyer, educator, and business person. So I got a good exposure. But Detroit was very powerful for me because I saw Black entrepreneurship and saw Barry Gordy, and everybody loved all the Motown records, Stevie Wonder, the Jackson 5, and so on. And we moved back to DC because of the recession in 1973 had really decimated the real estate market. So my mother had gotten a job in Washington, DC by phone. There's no internet back then, no Zoom, none of that. So they interviewed her by phone. And so she went to report to work, and they were kind of short with her, and then kind of let her go early, and then called her and told her that she didn't need to come back. That the market they didn't believe was ready for a Black woman to be heading up the sales department, sales office there, and the white sales team, the predominantly white sales team, would not be comfortable working for a Black woman. So she went back to being a secretary, and she got some temporary jobs, and then because she had to immediately support me because she was a breadwinner of our household, and then she. Got a full-time job at Fannie Mae as a secretary. Well, she was hardworking, and her boss found out her background, and then they put her on track and gave for an executive position, and she became a mid-level executive at Fannie Mae. And then ultimately, she left Fannie Mae when I kind of graduated high school and started her own real estate appraisal business. But my last 2 years of high school, my mother thought it would be good for me to get experience in politics. And DC had gotten home rule, which was the right to elect its own government in 1974. So my mother had me volunteer for a city council candidate and the chairperson of the city council. So ultimately, I became pretty knowledgeable about local politics as much as a 14, 15-year-old could be. And then so at 16, my mother suggested I become a page on the Hill. So what a page is you work on the floor of the House of Representatives, and you carry documents, and you're like a messenger on Capitol Hill, and it's reserved for high school students. And at that point in time, they had a high school there, which was on the top floor of the Library of Congress, next door to the United States Supreme Court, across the street from the U.S. Capitol. So after 6 months, of working on there, my term was up, but I had I'd met many of the Black caucus members. It was very early in the caucus history. I think there were 13 or 15 Black members of Congress. So one of them, Ron Dellums of California, and I became friendly. And so he gave me an internship. And my boss was a woman named Barbara Lee, who now has his seat in the House of Representatives. And then after that, my summer internship was nearing an end, and this was in July, so I didn't have a job for August, but I knew Charlie Rangel of New York, and then he gave me an internship. And then after that, I was going to have to go back to the public school I'd gone to in 10th grade, and I did 11th grade at the Page School. So I felt it was a great education, would look good on my resume, and exposed me to a lot. So I went to John Conyers, who knew my mother and my family from Michigan, and I volunteered in his office. And I asked to volunteer in his office, and he allowed me to do that. And then ultimately, I did a good job, and so within a month, they put me on the payroll. And so I ended up my last year of high school on the Hill, My graduation ceremony that day, the morning ceremony, was at the Rose Garden of the White House, and President Carter gave us certificates of achievement. And then that afternoon, we had our graduation ceremony in the Cannon Caucus room, which is the room where they elect the Speaker of the House of Representatives, big ornate room in the Cannon office building. And there we had our graduation, and then our prom was at the Botanical Garden. So it was a great experience. And my schedule was I had to get up in the morning at 4 o'clock, 4:30, and be at school at 6 a.m. And then I worked from 6 a.m. until about 10:30 or 11. And then I walked across the street to the Capitol, and I worked until Congress got out of session, which could be 4 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock. And I also played basketball. I was one of the top basketball players in the city of Washington. And I made a decision, consciously, that Capitol Hill would be better for me and take me further than if I continued to play basketball in my public high school, where I thought I could have been good enough maybe to play Division I secondary schools or Division II, but not go into the NBA. And I felt that it would be better for me to learn this, and so I did that. And so, but anyway, I had a very busy schedule, and it taught me time management, and I learned to build relationships on Capitol Hill. So I quit school. I graduated high school, went to Rutgers. I was going to be a doctor like my uncle. And after my first year, I decided, I went to Rutgers in Newark, New Jersey. After my first year, I decided that wasn't what I wanted to do. I didn't want to go into medicine. So I went back to Washington, D.C. It was 1979. And interest rates were 22%. But I decided I was going to be a real estate sales agent. So I got my sales license, and I was selling properties, but no one could qualify because interest rates were so high. Compared to rates today at 2 or 3%. So 10 times the cost of a house because of these interest rates. So I got a job with my mother working as an appraiser and learning the appraisal business. And around at that same time, the person who I'd met as a city council member had got elected mayor of Washington, D.C., Marion Barry. So he was in his first term as mayor of Washington, D.C. And so by the time he was going for a second term, I was appraising property for a living. I was 22, and so I gave him a couple of events and began to build a closer relationship with him. He was kind of a mentor to me when I was in high school, and so I got appointed he won re-election. I got appointed by him to the Property Tax Appeal Board, which is a board that oversees real estate assessments and appeals in Washington, D.C., so a very influential board. So I was appointed to that board by him at 22, 23 years old. And at 24, I became its chairman, which by far the youngest cabinet level position in the city. And a few years later, I developed my first office building in Washington, D.C. in 1986 when I was 26 years old. And I pre-leased that building to the city of Washington, D.C. The building was located in an area called Anacostia. At that time, the commercial quarter had been destroyed by the riots in '68, and the mayor had targeted for redevelopment. So I bought a site there, proposed building an office building, and the city pre-leased it. I built it under budget, and that was about a $10 million building. I still own it today. The government's been in there over 30 years, and we're just finishing the renovation of it, and the government's moving back into it. And that was my first development deal. From that deal to today, we now have $4 billion of development projects in our pipeline, and they range from projects in Boston, in the Back Bay of Boston, that's a $600 million project cost, to New York City that we're finishing off, which is about $550 million. A hotel project in Philadelphia that's on hold, but about $150 million. Another project, a hotel project because of COVID that's on hold in Washington, D.C., about $160 million. And then a 18-acre, 3-phase development in Charlotte, North Carolina, which would be a couple $2 billion. And then one of the tallest buildings in the Western United States in downtown Los Angeles with 2 towers, condos, apartments, and luxury 5-star hotels. And that's $1.6 billion. So, so entrepreneurship and real estate have taken me from, just from in one generation, essentially, from a hotel doorman to a hotel owner, from a hotel office, from a office building, clerical worker, as my father was, to a office building owner. I have been able to do that, and I've done it in a very different way, I think, than many of my peers in the development business, because I was shaped by the 1960s and the 1970s. I have a much greater political and social bend to what I do in business. And so I've been committed to equal economic empowerment for African Americans since day one. I also, for what it's worth, the last 3 years of President Obama's term, I chaired the Congressional Black Caucus that some of the members that I used to work for are members of. And I was the first non-member of Congress elected to that position. But entrepreneurship has given me the opportunity to achieve significant success as a business person and an entrepreneur, but be a transformer. I built what is considered the first major hotel in the United States to be built and owned by an African-American developer. I have broken barriers in terms of this industry as a whole, and I've tried to make sure that I've created opportunities for other people along the lines and along the way. And so I am a big believer in entrepreneurship. And I think that now, I thought coming out of the 1970s and going into the 1980s was a very transformative time in this country. And at the time in the 1980s, there were Black mayors of Washington, D.C., Detroit, Chicago, Atlanta, New York, L.A., Denver. So the major cities in this country were run by African Americans, and that ushered in a transformative change economically. I mean, Marion Barry, I believe, is the opportunities he gave to Bob Johnson gave Bob the opportunity to build BET, because Barry awarded Bob Johnson and John Malone the cable television franchise for Washington, D.C. And Bob had never done that before, and Barry gave him that opportunity, which is what created the platform for him to do BET. So Maynard Jackson knocked down all kinds of barriers. That's why the airport is appropriately named Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, because Maynard Jackson envisioned an international airport in Atlanta, and also made sure that it was built with at least 35% Black contractors. And so politics has had the impact of being transformative for our community and our country. And I think now the politics of this time present a tremendous opportunity, because for the first time in this country since the 1960s, the agenda of Black Americans is at the top of the list of discussion today. And that has not been the case. I mean, we left the civil rights movement, and after and you had, Johnson, then after Johnson, we had Nixon, and then we had Carter, and then Reagan. And it took, a long time to get to Obama. And now we're at a time in the country where there's great opportunity. So one of the things I would want to let the students understand is I don't believe there is a better time in this country to be a Black entrepreneur, to be a Black business person than there is today. And so there is tremendous opportunities. One of the things that we're doing as a company, and what I'm doing as an entrepreneur, is I'm raising right now a fund, a private equity fund, for emerging developers, which is really Black and female developers early in their career, so that we can provide capital to talented Black entrepreneurs in real estate who haven't had access to capital, because that's one of the biggest limitations or limiting factors impeding the progress of Black real estate developers. And so I'm gonna do my part to help knock down those barriers.
We're going to touch on all of that. I didn't want you to get too far ahead. So definitely how we work, students, if you want to, you can pop your questions into the chat, or if you respectfully, just if you have a question that you want to answer personally, what you could do is just let me know in the chat. I'll call on you, you unmute yourself, and we'll come in from there. If you're not actively talking or speaking, please put your microphone on mute. Mr. Peebles, you talked about some things that we definitely wanted to do a deep dive in and double click on and kind of get some deeper insight into you. So I'm gonna ask you the first question. And the first question that I want to know, in particularly, you know, who are the people that influenced you to get into real estate development? Did you look at other people in other cities, such as what Herman J. Russell was doing in Atlanta, or even people before you, such as Joe Morris and Bernard Garrett? You know, what did their journey impact what you were doing? Because you came along at such a pivotal time. I was just wondering, who were the people that influenced you the most in terms of real estate development?
I would say, look, the initial influence for me was my mother. She exposed me to the industry, and I saw the challenges that she confronted every day. I mean, and the challenges of being a Black entrepreneur in the first place are extremely challenging. Being a Black woman are almost formidable challenges, and so I saw that, and so it made me want to, you know, do business a different way. And I knew that developers were the ones at the top of the food chain in the real estate business. And so I, you know, was always taught to dream big and to aim high. And so I decided that that would be what I would do. And then I just had to figure out how to get there. And so I strategically, from the time I was 19 years old, had planned to be a real estate developer. And I will say this, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. was a government town. So it was a much more kind of conservative town. And I was kind of I was a new generation. I was a progressive. And my generation came through the civil rights movement. So we were much more aggressive in terms of opportunities in our dreams. So my aspirations were bigger. And I spent 1 year at Rutgers, Newark. So I spent a lot of time in New York City. And so I saw and my mother liked New York City, so I used to go to New York City a lot. And I saw the big buildings and so on. So I thought, okay, this is the kind of business I want to do. And so I read an article when I must have been 20 years old, maybe or so. I was visiting New York with some buddies of mine, and there was an article about Donald Trump, who was early in his career, and it had these big buildings he was doing. The guy was like 30 years old or so, and I said, "Wow, he's got these big buildings. He's living a fun lifestyle." I was a single guy. So I thought, okay. I want to be this big. And so that was kind of I would say, if there was an influence on me, it would have been my mother that prepared me to think I could do it. And then the yardstick was to be bigger. And that was what got me started. And then from there, I was just motivated to win. And it got to the point where, I faced some significant obstacles along the line. And so I began to self-motivate. And I believe ultimately, I worked for a different purpose, and that's kind of what gave me my guidance and drive. But I would say that, in terms of as a developer, there were probably a couple of developers in DC, but it really was because there was one Black developer, and he ended up dying with his son in an airplane crash. But that was in Washington, D.C., and that was somebody, Ted Higgins, who I looked at as showing that it could be done to be bigger and a big scale. So
you mentioned Donald Trump. Did you work with him directly or indirectly at any point during your career?
I met Donald Trump and was going to do a deal with his daughter and the Trump organization when I first started doing business in New York in 2011 or early 2012. A mutual friend of ours put Ivanka and I together a couple years before that, and so I was going to do a hotel in the Seaport in Manhattan, and I thought Trump International would be a good option. I considered them. I ultimately didn't do that deal with them, but we came close to it. And so that's when I met him and her, and I've met him over the years. I met with him when he first became president, as president-elect. I didn't support him as president. I mean, when he ran for president, but I met with him afterwards. And I met with him because I don't think that the agenda for Black Americans can be put on hold. I don't think we have enough time. We're 400 plus years behind. And we cannot put it on hold because we just don't like the person who's in power. So I met with him to talk to him about economic empowerment for Black entrepreneurs, and gave him some suggestions on how he could go about doing that. But I'd known him over the years. I met with him right before he became president. I mean, before he decided to run for president as well. So I know him in that way. But we're very different business people. He's responsible for me writing the People's Principles too. And I joked about this with him. I was traveling to San Francisco. We're working on a project in San Francisco, and I got in, kind of, early for San Francisco time, but late for the East Coast. So I, had dinner in my room, and I switched on the TV. So I'm sitting in the Four Seasons Hotel overlooking kind of the Bay Area and the lights in the window and the bay in the background. And he's on Larry King, and he's talking about how entrepreneurs are born, that you either have it or you don't. And I kept listening to this, and I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. I mean, my father was an auto mechanic and a file clerk. And I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I wasn't a born entrepreneur. I was going to be a doctor, but I developed myself into an entrepreneur, and he's dead wrong. So I decided, and I kept listening to it, and it kept bothering me. And so I decided that I was going to write a book, to prove that, entrepreneurs can be created, and you can self-create yourself as an entrepreneur. And because I felt that people would listen to him because he was extremely high profile, very famous, and all apparent eyes successful. And so people would listen to him, and I thought that, I felt I had a responsibility to correct that. And interestingly enough, I went to a couple of book agents and literary agents in New York, and they told me there was no market for my book. So I said, you know what do they know? So I went to Barnes and Noble or Borders, one of the two, and went to the section of books for dummies. And I got publishing of your book for dummies, how to get your book published for dummies, and a couple of other books on how to publish your book. So I read those, and then I hired a magazine editor who had covered me in my career a couple of times reasonably fairly, and they were entertaining articles. And I hired him to work on the book with me, and we did an outline. And I submitted it to just randomly emailed it to three different publishers, and then I got three publishing proposals, and then had them competitively bid a little bit, and then picked John Wiley and Sons, which is the top publisher for business books, and got my book published. So I tell that story because I want all the young people to understand that never take no for an answer.